Welcome everyone to this new episode of The Next Page, the podcast here at Library and Archives UN Geneva. Today we're going to explore the art and practice of mediation in a complex international landscape. We are in conversation with Pierre Hazan, and in this episode we speak with Pierre, whom I'm very pleased to see in our studio today, about his own experience in mediation and policy advice, as well as his most recent book and some of the books he has written on peace, justice, and diplomacy along his career. And we're talking about international affairs, and we're talking about the art of mediation, which has become entangled in the complexity of the international landscape. And for some decades now, it has evolved as well. So we want also to convey to our audience a sense of the evolution of mediation within the evolution of multilateralism. The podcast is about multilateralism, but a lot of that is linked to mediation and the way we mediate. I hope there will be time also to talk about a little bit the relationship between all these forms of mediation and the central role of the UN in this area that has evolved as well with time. So, Pierre, welcome to our podcast, and please introduce yourself to our audience so they get to know you a little bit better before our deep dive into mediation.
Well, good morning, Francesco, and thank you so much for having me. My name is Pierre Hazan. I've been working in mediation in armed conflict for a number of years. Previously, I was for a short while working with the UN at OHCHR, Human Rights Body. And previously, I was in academia, and before that, I used to work for 20 years or so as a journalist covering crisis and war zones in many, many countries, including the Balkans, the Great Lakes region in Africa, the Middle East, Afghanistan, Sudan, and so many other places.
So what first sparked your interest in these topics, in mediation in particular, and how have you developed your knowledge and insights?
Well, I think there is something very personal, I guess. My family, and I was very small actually, I was 4 years old when we arrived in Switzerland as refugees. So the question of dealing with conflict is something I know intimately. And I thought that it would be very important for me to do my bit. So that's why first I started in journalism, and then I moved to the UN and then to mediation. And I have to say also that when I was a journalist, it was the 90s mostly, and it was a time of tremendous optimism for a very, very short while. You may remember, you're smiling, in 1992 there was the Agenda for Peace, and Boutros-Ghali was even thinking that a UN army could exist one day. I mean, we are so far of that today. So we see this tremendous evolution. But also during the 90s, there was a change of norms. New norms were emerging. The question of international criminal justice, the first tribunals in former Yugoslavia, in Rwanda, the Rome Statute with the International Criminal Court, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa and in some other places. Immunity, which is being limited, blanket amnesty, which is no more allowed. So there is dramatic change of the scenery, of the landscape regarding norms. And in the same time, we have also the UN playing a central role in intervening and helping to resolve crises. And we see the UN in so many places, in Namibia, in Guatemala, in Salvador, and so on and on. So that's created a fascinating period. And in the same time, we could see some tensions between different norms being played out. And one of them, which interests me a lot because I was working a lot in so many conflicts, and the same problem happens in all these places, basically, is what we call today the peace versus justice tension. On the one hand, obviously, you want peace. And on the other hand, there is this new motto, this new idea that war criminals are not acceptable at a peace negotiation. There is a joke we used to say, if you kill one person, you go to jail. If you kill 100 persons, you go to a psychiatrist hospital. If you kill 10,000 people, then you are invited to a peace conference and you may receive a Nobel Peace Prize. I think in the 90s, this type of thinking was no more valid. It was a very different period with the ICC and other bodies. So the question was, how do you resolve this tension? So I was very much interested in that, and eventually I've done a PhD on these questions.
Let's focus a little bit on this question of this tension. And you researched it in your PhD. What is the outcome of that research? What is that we could learn from your research in how to overcome the tension?
Well, I think to overcome this tension, we need to redefine the two terms. What is peace and what is justice? And basically, if you want to unpack the concept of peace, you have two definitions. One of the prosecutors, which is a positive peace, something which is almost reconciliation. And then you have a peace which is more defined by the mediators, which is a negative peace, the absence of war. So basically, mediators are aiming for a negative peace. They are pragmatic people. They are not putting preconditions. They are not speaking about morality. And prosecutors, because of a mandate, they want to sanction war criminals. So that's why we had this tension between the mediators versus the prosecutors. Regarding justice, a lot of people tend to see justice only as the retributive definition, but justice is much larger. First of all, it includes truth. Without any truth, you cannot have any justice. It involves possibly reparations. It involves possibly also restorative justice. And it could also involve retributive justice. So basically, you have a menu. So when you are confronted to this tension, the question for you is to try to inject some justice elements according to the peace equation of a peace process which allows to do so. So first of all, you may start modestly. And then because the political equation is changing, then you will have more and more justice elements, including retributive justice. So justice takes time.
Justice takes time, and so does peace. Since we are in definition, I would like to invite you also to give us a portable and memorable definition of what mediation is. From the expert you are, and the practitioner, because you've done actual mediation. So how should the audience take this away from the podcast? What is a portable definition of mediation?
Well, I guess you have a lot of different definitions. One of them is basically a third party which is trying to mitigate violence and possibly resolve conflicts between different parties at war. Mediation could also mean something more modest as facilitation or good officers, but basically it's helping to mitigate violence and resolve conflicts.
I think it's fair now to introduce this element of complexity that we underlined also in the title of this episode. What is your sense of the evolution of the practice and principles of mediation while the international landscape got more complex over time? How did it all play out in the years and experience? You have so many examples that you can bring to this table of your own personal role in several conflicts. How the complexity reflects on the capacity and the ability to mediate?
Well, if we try to do a very short history of mediation since the end of the Cold War, we can basically divide three different periods. Then the first period is basically the 90s, is the golden era of the UN, and a lot of people didn't see at the time, including myself, that the UN was so successful basically because the Americans, which were the superpower, were using it as their vehicle. And it was very effective. So it was this golden age of the UN. And at the same time, there was this idea which we just discussed, that some people cannot be sitting at the table because they committed atrocious crimes. So there was this first tension between peace and versus justice. And then there was 9/11, and we are moving to a very different era with the concept that there is basically the return of the concept of just war. And people who committed quote-unquote terrorist organizations and terrorists, they cannot be acceptable as partners for peace. And we see a lot of countries and even the EU and other organizations trying to do lists of so-called terrorist organizations, which creates a very difficult problem because on the one hand you say, I don't want to discuss with these very bad people. And in the same time, you want to eradicate them, but you are not able to do so. So that's creating a kind of impossible contradiction that you need to resolve. And that's how that basically at that period, we have new actors which are emerging. It's non-official organization of mediation. Some people say private mediators, and which it's correct. But if we want to be more specific, these organizations, and I work for one of them, the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, these organizations are basically being paid by mostly European countries. So it's more non-official organizations than private per se because of a source of financing. And we see these organizations being extremely active. The Center for Humanitarian Dialogue is active in 2/3 or even more conflicts worldwide today, so it's significant. So it complements basically the role of the UN and other regional organizations and states sometimes. And the third period exactly, for me, is around 2011 and 2012. So basically, we have Pax America #1 during the 90s. Then after the 9/11, and for 10 years, basically, we have the so-called war on terror. And then we have a new period, which is no more Pax Americana from one way or another way. It's a much more polycentric world. And for me, Libya and Syria are the moment where things are changing. Libya is the last moment when the UN is intervening and they are using for the first time the responsibility to protect this new concept, which was framed after the genocide in Rwanda. But a lot of countries, including in particular Russia and China, they perceived it as a regime change because populations in Libya are no more in danger at the time. And basically they say, we don't want these tools that the Western world are using in order to intervene and to do some regime change. And that's why we decided to oppose the R2P, the responsibility to protect, but also in Syria, human rights, and also the International Criminal Court in Syria as well. So during a space of 1 year, you see a dramatic change of scenery. We see also that, and it's true to say that what the Americans did by invading Iraq started to unravel a number of norms, which created a new situation and creating a lot of suspicions about the use of some instruments.
You mentioned the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue here in Geneva that has a role of mediation that is, if not private, is an alternate way of mediating. It's an instrument, actually, and we know how these instruments have evolved in today's world. Have they evolved because the UN is not doing enough, or have they evolved because what the UN is creating is also more opportunities for complementary ways of deploy mediation? What is the evolution telling us?
Well, basically, the UN can mostly intervene as a mediator if the Security Council wanted to do so. So there are a number of situations in which the UN is very much active. I can think of so many places. And there are other places in which the UN is totally absent. It's present only with its humanitarian leg, but not as a mediation body. We can think about Ukraine and Russia, or what's happening in the Middle East with Israel and Hamas and Lebanon. So we see that there are different situations. That's one dimension. And then there are also new challenges, and sometimes the UN is not very much equipped. Let me give you a very concrete example. I worked a lot in the Sahel region, and basically, to say it a bit bluntly, a number of states have collapsed. And because of climate change also, there have been a lot of micro conflicts between different communities. Basically, because of climate change, there are no more the traditional corridors for transhumance, for animals. And so the herders tend to go to farming lands, which obviously create new conflicts. So what we did with the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, we help some communities to find ways to find a better repartition of limited resources. I'm talking about farming land, I'm talking about water, in order to appease the situation. And I think some 50 limited peace agreements have been signed with our support. And the way it's done, it's very interesting because it's not at all Western. I was not doing that myself. It was my colleagues who were active. And my colleagues were obviously local people. And so they use the traditional culture and bringing the whole community and sometimes 300 people to discuss openly for 3 days along these questions about farming and how to deal with the different needs of the different communities and water allocation. And sometimes you have one representative of an armed group which is basically running the place, and you have one representative of a state, a prefet or something like that, but their role is just somehow to bless the agreement. And so these deals are very important because the state is no more able to function. But in the same time, I have to say, these deals are also fragile because the situation can change on the ground. So it's not a foolproof solution. It's a limited attempt to change and improve the life of communities. And so that's an example of how mediation is evolving. And we have seen other trends which are interesting. Actually, it was the UN Secretary General which at one point mentioned during the pandemic that ceasefire should intervene in order to help the vaccination of population in conflict zones. We know that there are basically 200 million people who are living under the total or partial control of armed groups. It's a huge number. And my organizations, but also other organizations, have been instrumental in helping to set up these ceasefires and help the vaccination happening. I'm thinking about it's what happened in Central African Republic, but also in other places. So there have been a lot of new trends happening, and I think that's a very interesting evolution.
What is that you have kept as a lesson from the lessons of this evolution for you as a professional in the area of mediation that you can share with us? One or two strong learning points.
So basically, to put it simply, we moved to conflict resolution to conflict management with transactional deals. What is a transactional deals? Let me give you a very simple example. When Ukraine and Russia, which are at war, decide to allow the export of some grains, and for a time Russia say, yes, I'll do it. And Putin decided to reconnect twice, and then one day say, well, I'm no more interested. I think it's not working in my benefit, and it stopped. So it was a very transactional. It's hard to imagine, but only 1 year, 2 years ago, there was an agreement between Israel and Lebanon. You know, Israel and Lebanon, they have been at war since 1948. So Lebanon doesn't recognize the state of Israel. Nevertheless, some 18 months ago, the US was able to mediate an agreement between the two countries in order to delimit the maritime border, because both countries want to exploit the gas in the Med Sea. So you see, for very economic reasons, both countries which are at war can agree on something. Again, it's extremely transactional. So I think, first of all, we are moving to this new era, which is, I don't salute it, but it's a fact. The second dimension, I think, which also contributed me to write this book, is to reflect about the responsibility of a mediator. Sometimes mediation or mediators could be confronted to very hard choices, to moral dilemmas. And it's something we don't talk about it, and very, very, very little information or discussion or debate about it. And I think it's quite a shame. And let me give you a few examples. In Bosnia-Herzegovina, and later in a different context, in Syria, there was a terrible situation, as we know. And in Bosnia-Herzegovina, there was a policy of ethnic cleansing. And a very difficult question for the UN, but also for other organizations like the International Committee of Red Cross and others, was to decide what to do. Are you just doing nothing, knowing that some people might die as a result? Or you are helping the process of ethnic cleansing, of deporting people, knowing that it's a war crime. So we'll be an accomplice of war crimes, but possibly you will be saving lives in the same time. So what is the good solution? I think there is no good solution. There are terrible choices, but these terrible choices, we need to be confronted. So the question of the responsibility of mediators, I believe, it's very important. Let me give you different examples. The peace versus justice debate we talked earlier. Sometimes, in order to reach a peace agreement, you will put in parentheses justice. Obviously, it's not ideal. Here you have almost a conflict between short-term and long-term interest. Because short-term, you are reaching something. But you know that if you don't include some justice elements, the risk of impunity is massive. And then the will of history happening, then revenge and violence will start again. So here again, you have this tension between peace and justice. And the question how mediators want to include that dimension is very important. We have sometimes situations where in a peace treaty you want to include human rights. And I can think about a specific example in Aceh, for instance, in Indonesia. And at the last moment, the two parties decided jointly that they didn't want this provision to happen and excluded any guarantee regarding human rights. So I think it's very important for mediators, for organizations who are working in that field, to have some kind of moral compass. How far should I go? Is neutrality acceptable when there is an aggressor and aggressed? Or should I go to a more limited definition and go with a concept rather of impartiality? So there are a lot of things to discuss, and very often mediators want to reach an agreement as soon as possible and tend to exclude a number of problematic elements. And I think these discussions are very important in order to be on the right side of history, basically.
And the book you're referring to is a 2024 book, the latest you wrote, and the title is Negotiating with the Devil Inside the World of Armed Conflict Mediation. It's published by Hearst, and I wanted to ask you, as a mediator, what really motivated you in writing this book? Because there are things or secrets of the trade that a mediator would possibly not want to disclose. So what motivated you?
Well, because I think I went to, we mentioned Bosnia-Herzegovina, but the Middle East and the Great Lakes and some other places. And I think there are basically two elements. One, I wanted to find a book which basically tell me what happened the last 30 years. What was the evolution of mediation in armed conflicts? And I couldn't basically find this book. So I felt the need, even for myself, to clarify my mind and try to come with some basic understanding of the evolution of norms, the evolution of a trade, and the challenges. The second dimension is to try to elaborate some kind of moral compass when mediators are confronted to very difficult challenges. And maybe the third element is to discuss about the new tools, the new actors, the new realities of today. With we are in a very, very different landscape, and I think it was very important to take into account this new landscape.
And just for our listeners who are clients of our library, this book is available from our catalog. I believe we also have the French version, which was published in 2022. I wanted now to move on to something I wanted to ask you, since I heard you when you introduced yourself and you mentioned your experience with the UN. Now, in retrospect, when you look at your experience with the UN and your experience in all these mediation campaigns and your experience also as a thought leader in this area of mediation, what is that you would say the UN has lost and gained over the years of its evolution in this specific area of mediation for peace and justice?
Well, it has lost naivety. I think for a lot of people of my generation, if I can use that expression, I went to school in Bosnia-Herzegovina and in Rwanda. And suddenly you are confronted to an abyss. And I think the UN was confronted to huge challenges and was not equipped to. If we go back, it's hard to imagine, but at one, I remember the early 90s. And, sometimes because of a time difference, some people in the fields in Bosnia-Herzegovina wanted to have a decision taken by New York, but everyone was sleeping. I mean, that's inconceivable today. And even if we go further in terms of reflection, some decisions which were taken, basically some mandates which were impossible to fulfill, or there was a lack of political will to fulfill them. And here I'm referring, among other things, about the concept of zones of security. And we know what happened in Srebrenica when between 8,000 to 10,000 people were assassinated in so-called security zone of the UN under Chapter 7 of the Charter. We realize what happened at the time and the limitations of the UN. So I think the UN has been in a learning curve for a very long time, has been confronted to huge challenges. And I think today we are facing a very new situation with a new US administration coming, which is very isolationist and really, frankly, doesn't like the UN at all, which basically will have a very deep effect on specific conflicts, and including in the role of the UN, including in humanitarian action, and I'm thinking about the Middle East and the role of UNRWA, and in some other places. So I think today, in a very divided Security Council and even paralyzed, with a very skeptical US administration, we are entering in a very different world. We are also entering in a much less Western-centric world. And we need also to understand that a couple of trends, there are roughly 60 conflicts today happening, 60 active conflicts. We have 120 million IDPs and refugees, huge numbers. 200 million people living under the control of 450 armed groups. It's huge, massive numbers. And we have, obviously, which is the most worrying trend, the fact that $2.4 trillion have been spent last year in arms, in defense. So basically, everyone is getting ready for war. And knowing that population will grow tremendously, moving from 8 billion to 10 billion by 2050, mostly in Africa and in Asia, that will create new tensions. So I think we are moving to a much more violent world, much more polycentric world, and we need a lot of new tools. And I see some positive aspects. I want also to mention, I don't want to depress you, but we see the role of local actors. We see the role of women much more active, the role of young people, the role of civil society. And I think this gives room for some hope. We see new technologies, and we know that technologies could be a force for bad, for fake news, but a force for good as well. Just as an example, there have been, in a few places, there have been some codes of conduct which have been established with civil society in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in central Nigeria, regarding hate speech. So we see also new trends. The pandemic, the COVID ceasefire was also a new evolution. So there are new elements, obviously artificial intelligence, which raises a lot of very interesting questions. One question, as I'm scratching my head, is what does it mean to have a digital ceasefire today? I don't know, but we need to find out. So I think that's fascinating, and that's opening the way for a lot of work and research.
Well, I notice that there is a certain balance between the pessimistic views and the reasons for hope that you bring into the table. So I'm encouraged by the second part. I do see, of course, and I agree with you, all the downward trends are there, they're visible. But I'm particularly happy that you could share with us these reasons for hope, this positive, potentially even more positive in future when we talk about technology, for example. That is really a constant in the evolution of international relations and humankind. Technology, from the will to the press to AI, it's a story of our own civilization. Homo sapiens is intent upon doing technology, basically. This is what I see when I look back into the millennia. I wanted to ask you, as we wrap up this episode with you, clearly your experience is very long. I wanted to pick your brain on the wisdom that this experience has left in you as a professional, as an academic, as a former UN staff, as a mediator. Share with us one grain of wisdom that could be useful, especially for those who are younger than us and they're listening and trying to, latch on to some form of wisdom going forward.
That's a tough one. No, I think everyone needs to do something positive and leave something positive in this world. And I don't have a huge message to deliver. You know, there was Gramsci, the Italian philosopher. Well, he spoke about the pessimism of a mind and the optimism of a will. And I think it's very important to have this balance and to have the optimism of a will.
Thank you so much. Pierre Hazan, thank you for being with us on The Next Page. I wish you a lot of luck with your latest book, and I hope to see you again on the podcast.
Great. Thank you so much, Francesco.